I'm Morgan, and today I want to talk about my thoughts on the new movie Emily. So I was very excited to see this film because I absolutely adore the Brontë sisters, and honestly, I feel like Emily is the one who I feel most relatable to just because of how she is very standoffish, and in real life, just as in the movie, like, she kind of prefers wandering around on the moors to actually hanging out with people. Like, she was never, like, really a people person, and I love that the way that the characters were portrayed in the movie. I feel like they were very accurate to like what we know of them from real life, and I also love how the actors, like, I feel like the way that like the hairstyles, the outfits, and also like the facial features of the actors, like they do look like my images in my head of what I imagine the Brontes to look like. And I think that's also because there is at least one surviving portrait with all three of the Bronte sisters that survived to adulthood, painted by, I believe, Branwell, because Branwell was like, he was an aspiring artist at one point, and I absolutely, like, I adore this movie's depiction of Branwell because it does show how unstable of a person that he was in real life. He was a very unstable person who not only had trouble like holding a job for long periods of time, but he also like had some issues where at one point I believe he fell in love with like his employer's wife, and that led to some issues, as well as the fact that he had major issues with addiction, including alcohol. And I think that he might, like, that the opium thing might have actually been accurate too, because I think it's theorized that he might have been addicted to opium, but I'm not 100% sure. Like, I don't remember that for certain. So that would be something to like definitely like look up and double check to make sure that that was accurate. But I feel like some of the plot with Emily, specifically with her character, it didn't necessarily feel in character for Emily specifically. Like, for instance, while she was super close to her brother and stuff, I got the impression that she was fairly close to Branwell. I don't think of her as being like someone who did like drugs or alcohol, really. And I didn't like when she got that tattoo on her arm that was like freedom and thought, because there was actually a much cooler story that like the directors could have gone with, because in real life, Emily Brontë, like, okay, she was someone who, she loved nature and she loved animals, which wasn't always necessarily the best combination ever, because at one point she got bitten by a stray dog that she suspected might have been rabid, and this was at a time when there really were not any treatment options for rabies at all. And so she was like concerned, hey, I might have just gotten like bitten by a rabid animal. So she cauterized her own arm. Like, if I remember correctly, she burned her own wound with a like hot clothing iron or something in order to avoid having to tell her family. And like, she, if I remember correctly, like, she didn't tell them, or she wasn't planning on telling them until like she was certain that she wasn't gonna get rabies. But I remember like thinking that that was one of the most badass things ever. Like, Emily Brontë just is like her, sometimes I don't understand her motivations. Like, oh my gosh, you seriously thought not telling your family about the fact that you might have gotten bitten by a rabid animal was the best way to go about handling this situation. And I remember her being just like such a badass human being, and I love her. I absolutely love Emily Brontë as a person. She is just absolutely freaking fascinating of a human being. So I was disappointed that the director of Emily decided to just have her get tattooed instead of having her like burn her own arm, because the burning her own arm was obviously cooler. And I also disliked how they didn't even include like her absolute obsession with animals, because it's like, okay, to be perfectly honest, it is theorized that Emily Brontë may have been on the autism spectrum, which I feel like the the director really played into with, for instance, how freaked out she got, like, in new social situations when, like, at one point she was, like, freaking out in the movie, and I'm like, yeah, it seems like that's something that to me is relatable, and, like, the way that she oftentimes would move her body weird, sit weird, have different ways of, like, let's see, like, facial expressions and stuff, and the way, like, that she would look when she was walking and stuff, it just was it reminded me more kind of me, in that she was a little bit doing things her own way versus what everyone else in the world around her was doing. And so I really feel like they did an excellent job of portraying Emily, one, for how she actually was, because she was, if I remember correctly, described as being a little bit different or a little bit awkward or strange in real life. And I also love that because as someone on the autism spectrum, I'm like, yeah, she's super relatable as a character. But for that reason, I also am super disappointed that they didn't include her super, like, really how well she got along with animals, because I feel like getting along better with animals than people sometimes is something that is also, like, an autism thing, or at least common among those of us on the spectrum. And I, like, she also, like, she had a dog named Keeper who, like, absolutely was, like, they got along super well. And Keeper was with her when she died, like, if I remember right, like, their accounts of him, like, being there, like, when she died, and then the dog was, like, depressed or sad afterwards, and, like, never fully recovered his spirits after Emily passed. So I feel like that was something that would have been, like, touching, and that I wish would have been included in the movie. And also, I didn't like the whole romance subplot. Okay. Hear me out. It was out of character for Emily, because Charlotte, her sister Charlotte, is the one who they should have had a romance plot, like, subplot for, because in real life, Charlotte was the one who was out there having, like, like, getting involved in relationships that, like, would not have been societally condoned, because, like, Charlotte, like, she was freaking lusting after her professor at one point, the one in Brussels, who was actually married. I remember at one point, like, the wife of the guy, like, super snubbed her, like, like, showed up to a meeting that she had invited the professor to or something, to say goodbye or something, if I remember right. But, like, the wife was really, like, not happy with Charlotte. And I'm just saying, Charlotte is exactly the sister that would have gotten involved in, like, romances and stuff. And I'm just like, it doesn't really strike me as super, like, Emily, at least what I know of her. Like, I do feel like the actors had chemistry and stuff, but I'm just like, the whole romance plot just is out of character for Emily. And yeah, I don't know, like, that's just honestly my thoughts on the subject. And like, there were things like, what's something, she had, like, some moral, like, philosophical conversations with the guy in French, but honestly, I do feel like that's something that would have been more Anne, because Anne, in her writings, like The Tenant of Wildfell Hall and stuff, definitely has some really deeply, thoughts that are would have been considered controversial at the time around, like, Christianity and stuff. Like, if I remember correctly, I think it's Helen, deeply is insistent that, like, all sinners, like, regardless of how much a person has sinned, that they'll end up going to heaven afterwards. If I remember correctly, like, that's her character's beliefs, and I think it's called universalism or something, which was considered kind of controversial at the time. So it's like, I really feel that the character who would have been going head to head with the new curate dude would have been Anne. Like, she would have been the one having deep philosophical conversations with that guy rather than Emily. Like, that just doesn't seem as much Emily's thing. But yeah, but it is sad because we don't really have a lot of surviving writings from Emily compared to her siblings. But I will say I love how this particular movie was very strongly, very clearly influenced by Wuthering Heights. First of all, from like the mask scene, which like I'm not 100% sure how common that particular parlor game was in like Victorian England era, but I do know that parlor games were common, and so I liked that as a way of like building a theme. It really reminds me of there's that scene towards the beginning of Wuthering Heights where like is it Lockwood gets like woken up in the middle of the night by something rapping at his window, which could have been a nightmare, but it could have been the ghost of Catherine Earnshaw, depending on how you want to interpret it. I really loved that ghost, like that embodiment of like, you don't know, is it a ghost? Is this just something that was all in her head? Like I loved that. I love that. I felt like it really pulled from or drew from Wuthering Heights. I also really loved the scene where Emily and Branwell are spying on their neighbors and like spying through the window and then eventually get like chased off by the dogs, because that is something that is from Wuthering Heights. Like I don't know if she actually like spied on her neighbors IRL, but Catherine and Heathcliff did in Wuthering Heights. And so I loved the choice to include that, because that is very, very clearly influenced from Emily's writing. But other things that I didn't really like about the movie, how they focused too much on Emily specifically being like a writer and had her book being published as like showing it as being published by Emily Brontë, because if I remember right, like all three of the sisters were like writing works and wanting them to be published around the same time-ish, and they originally wrote under pseudonyms, so it does seem a little bit weird that they were focusing so strongly on Emily as a writer instead of like understanding that, hey, like all three of the surviving sisters had like they were passionate about writing, and they all of them eventually I think had works published within their lifetimes. But unfortunately, like Emily's only surviving novel, besides a little bit of poetry, was Wuthering Heights. So we didn't get to see more of her work, unlike Charlotte and unlike to a lesser extent Anne. And yeah. Oh, I also wanted to say that I loved the costuming. And a lot of times, like in period dramas, like the hairstyles being loose and stuff like feels too modern, but for the character of Emily, I loved it because she spends so much of the time out on the moors. She's very much so portrayed as a character who's a little bit eccentric, and so that just fits perfectly with her wild nature. I feel like it works with her character, and I love the way that throughout most of the film, the characters are they're dressed in hairstyles and clothing that would have been more typical for the period. I loved the dresses, like the way that the skirts were very, like, it reminded me of 1840s, but they're also ones where it would just be like perfect to like dance around in the rain, and they're just lovely costumes. And I loved thematically the theme of the movie, like the feelings of the movie I felt like were really strong. I really loved that. But I do feel like this is a movie that I probably would only watch a couple of times. Like the whole romance subplot, just it didn't really I just didn't necessarily think that it was the right thing for this particular movie. I didn't feel like it was right for Emily Brontë, specifically. And it's like, if I wanted the whole big romance subplot, I would just read like Wuthering Heights. But that one, I honestly feel like Wuthering Heights is more of a revenge type story, rather than just like pure romance. It feels a little bit more obsessive at times too. Yeah, I do love the characterizations of the characters in Emily. I love the costumes. I love the way that the dad was kind of like a little bit inattentive, like I feel like he was in real life. I love the kind of realistic relationships, dynamics between the siblings, where it's like Charlotte and Emily don't always get along the greatest, because that's how siblings actually are in real life. Like they don't always get along. And so overall, I really loved the movie, but I do feel like there were a lot of choices where I'm like, this just doesn't seem like quite right, or where it's like, I feel like this would be out of character for Emily, or I feel like this wasn't the right choice for this particular film. Like the whole romance thing, like how do I put this? Oftentimes, like I love like chick flicks, romance movies, but I just don't feel like that's Emily Brontë, you know? But yeah, so those are my thoughts on the film. Though honestly, I would say I liked it less than I liked one time I saw. Uh, okay, there was this one woman play about Charlotte Bronte that I saw at a literary festival, and I loved it so much that I specifically tried to find seats to see it a second time. And this was when I was a teenager, and I still like absolutely adored that play. So honestly, I'm going to say that this was not my favorite Bronte adaptation, or like really focused on one of the Bronte sisters works of art. Like I actually preferred this random one woman play about Charlotte Bronte to Emily, despite the fact that this clearly had like more of a budget and a wider release. But I still think it was worth watching. It's just I had a lot of things that I loved about it, but also a lot of things that I didn't love so much about it. So yeah, I wanted to give you my honest opinion as someone who absolutely adores the Bronte sisters and finds their lives freaking fascinating. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about my thoughts on this movie, and I hope that you're having a great day. Bye!